where your property taxes go, breaking down school funding and state aid.
Vlogging pod starts like a conversation. Cup of coffee with no destination. Just voices trying to understand what's happening across this land. From your stories told to the pages turned. Every question, every word, supported by SheShareStudios.net.
Hello, and welcome to the Vlogging Pod. Property taxes are one of the most common financial obligations Americans face, yet they are also one of the least understood. Most people know they pay them. Most people know schools are connected to them somehow. But far people understand how property tax evolved historically, how school funding became tied to property values, how levies work, how state funding formulas react to local revenue, and why so many taxpayers feel confused when schools continue requesting additional funding, even after levies pass. Now, we begin this because it's important to clarify. Property taxes are not unique to one state, nor are they new in American history. Versions of property taxation existed long before the federal income tax system was created. But because every state structures these systems differently, we're going to use one state as a primary example to explain how these systems evolved over time. Let's talk about Ohio. That's my home state. Not just because it's my home state, but because Ohio's school funding structure has become one of the most debated and legally challenged examples in the country. In early America, local governments needed ways to fund roads, courthouses, emergency services, and small public schools. Property taxes became one of the easiest systems because land and homes were visible formulas of wealth that could be assessed locally. At the time, government itself was much smaller than what America is known today. School systems were smaller, infrastructures were smaller, and administrative structures were far more limited. But as the United States expanded through the 1800s and early 1900s, the public education expanded with it. States pushed for mandatory attendance laws, transportation systems, larger school districts, expanded curriculum requirements, and standardized public education systems. All of that required stable, long-term funding. Now, property taxes gradually became one of the primary funding sources for public schools because they generated relatively predictable yearly revenue tied directly to local property values. But almost immediately, another problem emerged. Communities with expensive homes and higher property values could generate significantly more local funding than poorer communities could. That imbalance led states to create complicated funding formulas designed to determine how much state aid districts should receive based on local wealth and local taxing ability. And this is where school funding becomes far more complicated than most taxpayers realize. When voters hear a school district requires a levy, many assume the process is simple. The district asks for money, the community votes yes or no. If the levy passes, the district receives the requested funding. But modern state funding formulas do not operate that simply. In Ohio, the state uses a funding structure tied heavily to what is known as the Fair School Funding Plan. At the center of that system is a calculation attempting to determine two things. First, how much it should theoretically cost to educate students in a district. Second, how much that district should theoretically be able to contribute locally through its own property wealth and local income capacity. The state then attempts to fill in the difference between those two numbers. That means the formula is not simply looking at whether a levy passed, it is looking at the district's broader financial profile. The formula examines factors including total property valuation within the district, taxable property wealth, local income levels, enrollment numbers, transportation obligation, student needs, special education requirements, local tax capacity, and how much revenue the district is theoretically capable of generating on its own. This is where many taxpayers begin losing track of how the system works. Because when a levy passes, an additional local revenue enters the district. The state funding formula may now view that district as more capable of supporting itself locally. That does not necessarily mean the state literally removes levy money from the district. Instead, the formula recalculates the district's local share and state share. The more capable the district appears financially through local revenue and property wealth, the lower the state's calculated obligation may become. And this is the part many voters never hear fully explained. A community may pass a levy, believing the district will simply gain additional funding, while the state formula simultaneously adjusts how much state aid that district qualifies to receive afterward. But the system becomes even more complicated because of another Ohio law called House Bill 920. HB 920 was passed during the inflation heavy 1970s. Its purpose was to prevent local governments and school districts from automatically collecting dramatically large amounts of tax revenue simply because property values increased during inflationary periods. Under HB 920, when property values rise through reassessments, effective tax rates are rolled back so existing voted levies do not fully balloon alongside rising appraisals. On paper, that sounds like taxable protection, or taxpayer protection in this case. And in many ways, it was designed to be exactly that. But this created another complicated interaction inside the funding system. Because now you can have a situation where property values rise, the state formula interprets. The state formula interprets the district as wealthier. The district calculated local capacity increases. The state reduces part of its calculated aid obligation. But because of HB 920 rollbacks, the district may not actually receive the same level of real growth locally that the state formula assumes it can generate. That disconnect is one of the major reasons Ohio school funding remains so controversial. And this is also one reason communities sometimes continue hearing school districts request additional levels even after previous levies pass. From the taxpayer perspective, the reaction is often, we already approved more money. But from the district's perspective, rising transportation costs, pension obligations, staffing costs, inflation, utilities, maintenance, insurance, special education requirements, and formula changes may still leave major budget pressures in place. Another important part many voters never fully see is how levy money itself gets distributed once it enters the district's operation. Most people understandably picture levy money going directly into the classroom, but district budgets are often divided across multiple legally required obligations and operational systems at the same time. Those can include teacher salaries, requirement systems, and pension obligation, transportation fleets, building maintenance, utility, insurance costs, debt repayment for construction bonds, technology systems, administrative operations, special education compliance, classroom materials, athletics, and extracurricular programs. So even when levy funding enters a district, it does not necessarily flow into one single visible category the public immediately recognizes. And over time, this created growing frustration among many taxpayers with no longer fully understanding where each dollar ultimately flows once it enters the system. This confusion eventually became so significant in Ohio that the funding structure itself faced constitutional challenges through the DeRolf school funding lawsuit. In the DeRolf decision, the Ohio Supreme Court repeatedly ruled that the school state funding system relied too heavily on local property wealth, creating unequal education opportunities between wealthier and poorer schools. That ruling helped place Ohio at the center of the national debate surrounding property taxes, school levies, and educational funding equity. Today, the result is extremely layered system where money moves through multiple overlapping structures simultaneously. School levies, court auditors, property reassessments, HB 920 rollback calculations, state equalization formulas, bond obligations, school board budgets, transportation systems, pension systems, administrative operations, and state aid recalculations. All because of these systems interact together, many ordinary taxpayers no longer fully understand how school funding actually works after they approve a levy at the ballot box. It does not automatically mean every district is mismanaging money. It also does not mean schools are not facing legitimate operational pressures, but it does explain why school funding, property taxes, levies, and state formulas remain some of the most controversial and misunderstood financial systems affecting American homeowners today. Understanding how this system evolved historically helps explain why property taxes became tied so deeply to public education, why state formulas became increasingly complex, and why many taxpayers across the country continuing asking where their money ultimately goes once the system begins interacting with one another. Today's sources come from the History of Property Taxes in the United States, EH.net, Economic History Encyclopedia. Introduction to the Property Tax Formula Funding Connection, Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Ohio Fair School Funding Plan Overview, Olentangy Local School District. Ohio School Funding Format and Local Capacity Analysis, Ohio Association of School Businesses Officials. Understanding HB 920, Talawanda School District. HB 920 and its impact on Ohio schools. Nordia Hill City School District. DeRolf versus State of Ohio, Ohio History Central. Public School Revenue Sources, National Center for Educational Statistics. School Funding 101 in Ohio, Signal Cleveland. Property Tax 101, The Mechanics, Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Thank you for listening. Until next time, bye-bye for now.